Our first speaker this afternoon is Willis Sparks, who happens to be the Global Macro Politics Director of Eurasia Group, one of the leading risk consultancy in the world. And Willis is joining us from New York. Thank you, Willis. Good morning for you. And we are here in Dubrovnik, as you know, with PR professionals, professional leaders from all continents. And I was about to introduce you and say that before joining Eurasia, Willis worked at the Council on Foreign Relations in the US. He holds master degrees International Affairs from Columbia University, and he also holds 2 bachelor's degrees from Brown University. So Willis is a top specialist on global issues, and we will start with Willis sharing his vision on the complexity of the present global scenario that impacts political relations, economic relations, and we are another lead to social issues as well. After Willis' presentation, we will be able to address him some questions, okay? Willis, it's on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciro. Thank you very much. Good morning from Brooklyn, New York. I won't pretend that I don't wish I was in Dubrovnik with you in person. I've been to Dubrovnik. I know how lucky you are to be there. But I am delighted to be with you and honored to have been asked to speak today on this topic. It struck me what it was described a moment ago as the New World Order. It is new, and my presentation will be about the world. I don't know how much order there is at the moment, but that's what I'm going to get into over the next half hour before I get into your questions. So Ciro mentioned I work for a company called Eurasia Group. Let me just take a moment to describe Eurasia Group, because I think it'll help you understand the angle that I'm going to take on the world today. Eurasia Group is a political risk consulting firm, which means that we help our clients, corporate clients, investment clients, understand the politics of the countries and the regions that they are investing in, thinking of investing in, doing business in. We are politics specialists. We have offices here in New York, where I'm based, in London, in Washington, in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Singapore, and a few smaller offices in other places. So we are a global firm. As Ciro mentioned, my job title is Director of our Global Macro Practice, which simply means, unlike the 75 or so of my colleagues who have one country or one region in which they are expert, my job, like my boss, Ian Bremmer, who you may know or may have heard of, my job is to look at the world from a greater distance, as I'm going to do over the next few minutes this morning. To look at the big trends, to try and help provide our clients and help provide you this afternoon with a framework for thinking conceptually about what's going on in the world right now. What are the trends that are taking us from the past into the future? In what way is the world changing? What is driving that change, and what does that tell us about where we're headed? And I think if I can provide you a very broad framework over the course of a half hour or so, then I will have accomplished what I want to accomplish. As Ciro mentioned, I want to leave time for your questions, because I think the question part of these kind of speeches is usually the most interesting part. I'd love to know what you're interested in hearing more about. I do want to offer the caveat that in my half hour here, I'm going to say very little about what's going on in the United States. No particular reason for that, other than that the focus of my presentation is on what's happening with globalization. And I think that at this particular moment, there are other moments, certainly in the past and in the future, when the US would be a bigger part of my presentation. I'm focusing, for obvious reasons, on what's going on in some other parts of the world that are making headlines at the moment. Having said that, I invite any question you want to ask me about what's happening in America, what's happening in American politics, etc. So the other caveat that I want to offer, and I do this a lot, I've been making these speeches now for 15 years. And I feel like I need to say before I jump into this, I'm a risk specialist. So you're going to hear a lot from me about risk, and some of it is going to sound very dire. I'm actually looking at the screen in front of you that says future positive. And I want to say right off the top that although I'm going to be talking about risk and stress and crisis and emergency response, I don't think there's anything inconsistent with the idea of future positive, because we're in a moment of adjustment in the world at this moment, a moment of transition. It's going to be a painful adjustment. It already is a very painful adjustment and a sometimes chaotic transition. That does not mean catastrophe. That does not mean that we're talking about the end of the world here. And I hasten to add that because there are going to be times when I'm talking when you're going to think, boy, this doesn't sound good. But I think there are a lot of reasons to be positive about the future, which I'll touch on as we go, but also we can get into that in the Q&A session as well. So the focus of my presentation is on globalization. And I think globalization is a hard thing to talk about because it is so dominant in our lives today. I mean, here I'm in Brooklyn and you're in Dubrovnik and we're talking about the world. Globalization has been the central fact of our geopolitical and economic life for certainly for the last 30 years and really longer than that. It's so close to us, it's hard to have a look at it sometimes. Globalization, by which I mean all of the various processes by which ideas, information, people, money, goods and services cross borders at a speed that is unprecedented in human history. Globalization has accomplished a lot of good things. It has inflicted a lot of harm in some areas as well. But overall, it's created the first global middle class in the history of the world. It has brought a resilience to the international system that had never existed before. Globalization is something worth continuing to work on, I think, for the good of our clients and, for my opinion, for the good of the world. But globalization is clearly under stress. Now, one question that we get a lot at Eurasia Group, the most basic question of all is, given everything going on in the world right now, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, is globalization finished? Given the relationship between Russia and the West, between China and the West, given the erratic nature of American politics, is globalization finished? And the answer to that question is no, globalization is under stress. Globalization is not finished unless you are Russia, which leads me into the first thing I want to talk about, which is, of course, the war. We have to start with the war in Ukraine because you don't have to care about Ukraine or about Russia, for that matter, to understand that this war is touching every aspect of the life of international politics and the global economy at the moment. I'm going to talk about what's going on in the war, but think of the impact that it is having on the prices we pay for food and fuel in the world, just to name two really obvious, enormous examples. The war in Ukraine is a very obvious place to start, and it is at the moment the biggest stress on globalization, I'm going to argue. So let me just take a moment to talk about where we are in Ukraine. We believe at Eurasia Group that this war is headed for what you might call an unstable stalemate. That means that Russia is not strong enough to take Ukraine, and Ukraine is not strong enough to kick Russia completely out of the pre-2014 Ukrainian borders. So we're stuck with a situation now where the military focus is in the Donbass region, in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces in Ukraine, where at the moment there is a grinding war going on that is advancing about 3 to 5 kilometers a day. The Russians are trying to encircle Ukrainian forces and to inflict serious casualties, even more than have already been inflicted on Ukrainian forces, while at the moment the Ukrainians are fighting back, launching counteroffensives in the Kherson region, the area north and west of Crimea. So, we can get caught up in that, and we can talk about, the movements of various lines of attack and all of that. But the big picture here is we're headed for a stalemate that is unstable because neither side is going to be satisfied with it. And it's a stalemate that will certainly last for months and could last for years, depending on maybe on what happens inside Russia. Having called it a stalemate, I think it's important to understand that from a strategic standpoint, Russia's already lost this war. This is strategically an absolute disaster for President Putin, because essentially what Russia has earned during the course of this war is a series of Western sanctions from the US and Europe that are certainly going to be long-term sanctions. For our practical purposes, you might even refer to them as permanent sanctions. We've got a massive reorientation of the energy trade in Europe away from dependence on Russia. Again, we can get caught up in the day-to-day. We can talk about what Hungary's President Viktor Orban is what concessions he's trying to extract, or what the Slovaks and the Czechs are saying about the need to maintain oil through pipelines, et cetera. What Europe has done over the course of the past few weeks in making a plan to transition away from 90% of the oil imported from Russia is historically hugely significant and was frankly unthinkable 4 months ago. And here it's happening. So the Russians have earned sanctions. They've got this massive Western reorientation away from the energy trade. You have NATO expanding. The objections of Turkey's President Erdogan aside, Finland and Sweden are very likely to join NATO this year, in the near future, later this year. That alone will double the length of the border between Russia and NATO. Finland will add 810 miles of border between Russia and a NATO country when that happens. Again, Finland and Sweden joining NATO is another thing that would have been absolutely unthinkable a matter of a few weeks ago. And here we are. Russia is locked out of the global financial system. There is a brain drain going on where a lot of young, very talented Russian people are looking at what's happening in Russia. They're looking at the Russian economy. They're considering their own prospects, and they're finding ways to get out of Russia. And this war is going to gut the Russian army for a generation. The harm that is being inflicted on the Russian military at the moment, in terms of the people who are being killed, the Russians have, by best estimates, have already lost more troops in Ukraine since February 24th than the Soviet Union lost in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. All of the material that they've lost, all of the artillery that they've fired, all the tanks that have been destroyed. It's going to take a generation to rebuild the Russian army to the point that it was a few months ago. And you're liable to end up with a determined, permanent Ukrainian enemy. Volodymyr Zelensky seems well ensconced in Kiev. Russia does not pose any near-term threat to Kiev other than firing long-term artillery. So Putin has gotten permanent sanctions, a massive reorientation of the energy trade, NATO expansion, a Russian brain drain, an economy locked out of the global financial system, a determined Ukrainian enemy, a gutted Russian army. And in return, he's going to get the Donbass and a little bit more coastline on the Black Sea, and decoupling from the West. So when we say that globalization is under stress here more than anywhere else in the world, this is what we're talking about, because the changes that are going on between Europe and Russia, between the US and Russia, in the main are irreversible, at least as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. In the margins, yes, there may be some weakening of European or especially American resolve over time, particularly if we have a change of government in the United States 2 years from now. But that's speculative. I think for now, there is a full decoupling going on between Russia and the West. And while it is true that the Russians can always say, well, that's fine, we'll just sell our oil and gas and metals and minerals to our friends in China and India who'll be happy to buy them. We'll just reorient toward Asia. And they can do that to some extent. But that's going to take an enormous amount of time. It's going to take years for them to do that because they're going to have to build infrastructure that does not exist today, which is going to take a serious amount of time and a serious amount of money. And who is incented to pay for that? The Chinese may be very happy to loan the Russians the money at a kind of friends and family interest rate, but they're going to expect the friends and family discount price on the energy too. And that's already happening. In fact, China and India are buying more Russian energy at the moment, but they're getting it at a discount because anybody who can open a newspaper or flip open a laptop knows very well that the Russians have a lot fewer customers now than they did a few weeks ago. So Russia can reorient, but to reestablish where the Russians were before February 24th is going to be, it appears from this standpoint, the work of a generation, particularly since there's no prospect that the Russians are going to reverse themselves. So that's the Russian part of this. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not just a story about Vladimir Putin or about European leaders coming together to change their attitude toward Russia or US sanctions, because the war itself is exacerbating a lot of pre-existing global, not just regional, not just European problems. So as I'm sure all of you are well aware, the pandemic has already created a lot of debt problems in the emerging world. There are a lot of developing countries, emerging countries, however you want to classify them, low and middle income countries that have had to borrow enormous amounts of money to manage the fallout from the pandemic, to create infrastructure, that public health infrastructure that doesn't exist. So you compound that debt problem and all of the supply chain issues and all of the inflation pressures that have been created. Now you add the impact of the war in Ukraine on food and fuel. It's not just a question of the fact that Russia and Ukraine are two of the 5 leading grain producers in the world. Russia and Belarus are the 2 leading producers of fertilizer in the world. It's a multifaceted problem that is going to impact hundreds of millions of people, at least in the price of the food that they buy, if not the availability of the food itself. And then obviously there's the fuel question. If you're going to take that, the kind of Russian volumes of oil and gas offline as we make this transition, as they try to find customers in other parts of the world, we're going to have very volatile oil markets for some time. It's not going to last forever. Both food and fuel markets are going to adjust, but that adjustment is going to take time. It's going to be painful for a lot of people, particularly in the developing world. And the severity of that crisis may depend on how long the war in Ukraine lasts. And as I say, we're not optimistic that the war in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon, even if it ends up being a kind of frozen stalemate that threatens to become unstable at any moment. Let me move to Europe for a second. I have to say, having followed European politics from the United States all these years, that I think that Americans, maybe Europeans, I can't speak for that, but I think that Americans underestimate the scale of European courage. I'll just call it courage, of European leaders doing what they are doing at the moment. For all of the problems, and the media coverage will focus on, who's picking a fight and where populism is picking up in certain corners of Europe, and what Orban is saying today, or what populist leader may win an election in some European country in the future. But when you go back and you look at the European response to the sovereign debt crisis after the global financial crisis, so you go back 10 years and you look at the sort of North versus South dynamic of that sovereign debt crisis, and especially if you go back to the migrant crisis of 2015, 2016, and how much anger there was in Europe, which, arguably played a major role in Brexit. How much anger, how much disunity there was in Europe, all the obituaries that were being written in the American and even in the European media about the EU, what the EU has accomplished in organizing COVID relief funds across the Union. And the response to Russia has been historically remarkable and is worthy of note and frankly worthy of a lot of respect. Having said that, the adjustments that I'm talking about, the painful transitions, are going to be the defining story, I think, in Europe over the next 5 to 10 years, because there's tremendous sacrifice going on in Europe. But when you have simultaneously going on the effort to spend on COVID recovery and to share the money across the union and to deal with inflation and the supply chain issues that existed before the war, at a time when you're going to completely reorient Europe's energy architecture, and you're going to increase defense spending because of new levels of insecurity along the edge of Russia. Doing all of that simultaneously is going to be enormously painful, and it's going to have political fallout. So, we've seen this year that populism has yet to make a comeback. Emmanuel Macron didn't have that much trouble beating Marine Le Pen in France at the end of the day. German politics has obviously had a very interesting year. There is populism at the margins, but at the same time, Europe has shown tremendous unity, but the check is going to come, and Europe is going to be paying for that unity, and it's going to be an ugly, I think, again, I'm very optimistic about the future of Europe, but this transition period is going to be very ugly over the next 5 or 10 years as multiple expensive adjustments are being made at the same time. If we're going to talk about globalization, obviously we've got to talk about China. In fact, it doesn't usually take me this long to get to China in one of these presentations, because China is so central to the global system and to the way that we should think about the world, in my opinion. And there is a lot of attention on really poisonous rhetoric between China and the United States. And right before the Russian invasion, President Xi Jinping invited President Putin to come to Beijing to kick off the Olympic Games. And they made a big show of what they called their no limits friendship. Xi Jinping has said Putin's his best friend. If you look at Chinese media coverage of the war in Ukraine, it is very pro-Russian. It absolutely blames the United States, to a much lesser extent Europe, for the war itself. The Trump tariffs are still in place, despite all of the inflationary pressures in the US right now. There's a lot of ugliness between the US and China in the media, and with good reason. There's a lot of strategic mistrust. There are a lot of Americans who believe that China's expansion has to be contained. There are a lot of people in China who say our expansion is absolutely legitimate and you have no right to contain us. And underneath that, the good news is that while there is major stress in the relationship between China and the United States, China and the West more generally, there is also a recognition in China that at a delicate moment in Chinese politics, at a moment when President Xi Jinping is hoping to earn a third presidential term, which we expect he absolutely will be later this year, at a time when COVID has become a very frightening prospect in China, there is a recognition on both sides that there is an interdependence in the relationship between China and America and Europe that is the core of the relationship. That the American economy cannot succeed unless the Chinese economy succeeds. The Chinese economy cannot succeed unless the American economy succeeds. This is a non-zero-sum game, unlike Russia and the West. And however much affection Xi Jinping feels for Vladimir Putin and to whatever extent their worldviews coincide. China is in no position at the moment, given the delicacy of its economy at the moment, to throw over its relations with its top three trade partners, the European Union, the United States, and Japan, in the name of improving relationships with Russia, which is not even in China's top 10. So the energy relationship is important. The armaments relationship is important. The strategic relationship is important. But for the moment, I think that the stresses in the US-China relationship in particular are exaggerated. The headlines give the sense that there is a new Cold War, and that's just not how we see it at Eurasia Group. Another aspect of this is that in the relations between the US and China, the rest of the world doesn't want to have to choose. That's important. That's a very big difference between certainly the US-Soviet Cold War of the 20th century, or to some extent what may be going on now between Russia and Europe, Russia and the West. The rest of the world doesn't have to choose, including US allies in Asia, who want to preserve their security ties very much with the United States, but they don't want to lose market access to China. It's too important to them. They want to maintain the delicate balance. They want to be able to pivot between the US and China. US and Chinese leaders are very aware of that dynamic. They may try to use it to their advantage in tactical ways, but there is an interdependence that globalization has created that is under stress, but has shown that it can stand up to stress in the past, that remains resilient for the moment, and is the main reason why I think we should remain future positive. Adjustment is, I think, the order of the day. That's the theme that I would return to. We're going through a series of very ugly transitions that are going to be expensive, that are going to be extremely costly, particularly in lower and middle income countries. But I think on the other side of that adjustment, on the other side of these transitions, is a world that may, in a lot of ways, be more resilient than the one that we had before we entered a pandemic and before Russia invaded Ukraine. So with that, we're just past 2 p.m, your time, I believe. So I'm very happy to take your questions. Again, I'm happy to take questions about anything that I said that you were confused by or concerned about or disagree with or want to hear more about. But I'm also happy to talk about subjects that maybe I haven't touched on in the interest of time. But I do thank you for inviting me today. I thank you for listening. I hope that I've given you a valuable way of thinking about where we are in the history of international politics, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Willis. I'll kick off our conversation here. You mentioned that the fact that Belarus and Russia, they produce 80% of fertilizers, and commodities. Ukraine and Russia are among the top 5 producers. And I was reading a piece of analysis of Eurasia Group saying that food insecurity can reach 1.9 billion people by November this year. Could you go deeper in this sensitive issue?
First of all, that is obviously a worst case scenario. Our approach at Eurasia Group, when we're talking about something as uncertain as the course of a war, is to try to lay out the different scenarios that we think the war might develop in, from least disruptive to most disruptive. And 1.9 is the headline number, and it is a number to be taken seriously, but it is not base case. It's not where exactly we think that we're headed. The problem, the food problem, first of all, the food problem existed before the war. Let's be clear about that. The food problem is exacerbated by a lot of the supply chain issues that have followed on from the pandemic. But the war has made things worse because the grain is shut in, because the fertilizer is shut in. And from a practical standpoint, the question is, and this is something that obviously the European leaders were debating yesterday at their summit. They spent a lot of time thinking, how are we going to get product off of Ukrainian ships or out of Ukrainian warehouses, moving west into Europe, into the world beyond. Um, the problem with the Black Sea is that the area around Odessa, which is by far Ukraine's most important port, is mined. It's not only just a war zone with a lot of Russian ships patrolling, it's mined. There are Ukrainian mines there. I believe there are Russian mines there. And the Russians have offered a deal, which no one is interested in, which says, if you lift a lot of the sanctions on Russia, we'd be happy to let some of those ships cross the Black Sea and pass through Istanbul and enter the Mediterranean. That offer is a non-starter at the moment, and it's not clear what it would take to demine the harbor. And so now there's a focus on, well, could we move it out over land? And as I'm sure some of you are aware, you end up with a lot of logistical problems, like the fact that that Ukraine's railroad tracks are of a different grade. I forget what the exact terminology is, but the width of train tracks in Ukraine is different from the width of train tracks in the European Union. And so you have the problem of having to stop and load and unload, and it's a logistical nightmare. It's also a Russian target. It's something that Russia could target with long-range artillery. As long as the war remains stable, there will at some point be ways to get a lot more of that grain out of Ukraine. There may even be some diplomatic deal. But for the moment, it's really not clear how they're going to free up that grain, and that is the basis for the sort of worst case scenario projections of the impact of food. A lot of it's inflation too. And by the way, if you want to see a country that you might not think of where exactly this kind of pressure is being exerted, if you look at what's happened in Sri Lanka, it's a country of just 22 million people that doesn't get a lot of attention in the West, but it's been very politically unstable this year. There's been a lot of violence, and a lot of it has to do with food shortages that were the result of pre-existing problems that have been strongly exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And whether we're talking about Africa or the Middle East, or for that matter, the prices that Americans and Europeans pay for food, these are the variables that we're watching.
Okay. There's a question. Two people wanted to make questions, but allow me to remember, Willis, that you were talking to entrepreneurs here. Okay, so
yeah,
small, mid-sized, and some mid-sized to big entrepreneurs all over the world. And so we run our own business, and we have big companies as clients. So before passing the mic to my colleagues, a short answer on what we as entrepreneurs, what should be in our radar screen for the next few months, and what should we, how we could better advise our clients on what is supposed to happen next on the next few months.
Okay, I know there are hands in the air, so I'll be briefer than I would otherwise be. I think there's two answers to this. The answer that I always start with is resilience. I think that you have to persuade people that we live in an era of crises. Crises are, again, not necessarily catastrophes, but they are crises. We had a financial crisis in 2008, 2009. We had a sovereign debt crisis. We had the Arab Spring. We had the migrant crisis. We had Brexit. We had upheaval in American politics. We've had a pandemic. Now we've got a war. We live in a time of crisis. Baking in resilience into all of our plans, I think, should be essential to what everyone does, large and small. I think the importance of entrepreneurial thinking here, though, is critical. Beyond the question of resilience, we need to think outside the box. We need to come up with ideas that sound ridiculous, and we need to have the courage to offer ridiculous solutions to some very basic logistical and tactical problems. because very often the first ridiculous suggestion opens up an opportunity to come to a less ridiculous suggestion. And then people are using their imaginations in a way that maybe they're not trained to do in large institutions. Large institutions suffer from the weakness of group thinking, that they don't have necessarily the imaginative approach to strategic problems, that small and medium-sized company, and particularly entrepreneurs, this is what makes an entrepreneur so valuable for the entire global economy, is you have to have new ways of problem solving. And in a world, in an era of crisis like the one that we live in, that has never been more important.
Okay. Starting with Roy, Arturo. Okay. Just to please say your name and your country and city.
Yeah. Arturas Jankus, Lithuania, Vilnius. Russia declares that they are fighting American-centric world. To translate into normal language, it means they are fighting the right for the countries to choose their own path. So, and United Nations as a system, post-Second World War system, it doesn't work as a security system. So what do you think, what future security system of the world will look like?
I think you're dead on the money. I mean, the obvious question, if someone appeared from outer space and looked at the UN Security Council today and didn't know the history, they would say, based on what I see in today's politics and today's global economy, I don't understand why Germany and Japan don't have seats at the table and Russia does. I mean, you know, the UN Security Council is based on who won World War II and who lost. I think to your point about Russia saying that they're fighting Americans, that's an easier sell for Putin inside of Russia. It's a little harder to explain to Russians why they're fighting Ukrainians when President Putin has been telling the world now for several years that Russian Ukrainians are one people. I don't see any prospect of UN Security Council reform. So again, I think what we need is entrepreneurial thinking. We need new alliances that may be formed on individual issues to deal with problems of climate change, of the ways that new technologies are changing warfare and changing the workplace and changing our lives, the next global pandemic. We need entrepreneurial thinking to create something that can render today's out-of-date institutions obsolete, because they're not going to be replaced through traditional channels. Not anytime soon, anyway.
Hi, Ted Deutsch from the US. I think your camera might be there. Thanks for the talk and all the insights. We're a communications group. Just one communications question. We've seen, particularly in the Russia-Ukraine war, but in lots of instances, how much misinformation there is in the world today, government-sponsored or mainstream media misinformation, depending how you define mainstream media. And how much does that fit into your assessment of political risk? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the coming years, whether that tide is going to roll back or continue to roll forward?
It is a huge part. You know, this is a subject that my boss, who runs Eurasia Group, is very interested. The role of technology companies who have a kind of sovereignty in the digital world that ordinary governments can't touch. So I think that the positive way of looking at this is we are now aware of this problem of disinformation in the global bloodstream in a way that we weren't 5 years ago, having been through Brexit, having been through several elections where misinformation and disinformation played a large role. And yes, Russia and Ukraine are fighting an information war of their own at the same time. Again, I think that in a lot of cases, it's going to be public pressure on the technology companies, in some cases from their own employees. We're seeing a lot more employee activism inside a lot of different companies, including communications companies and tech companies, where the employees themselves are saying, we're not going to be associated with problems that we know are destabilizing the entire system. So again, I I think we have to have a lot more bottom-up thinking, because top-down, the ability of governments to govern cyberspace, to govern the digital world, when these technology companies, not just American technology companies, but Chinese companies and Europeans and others, control the space. I think that pressure from below and maybe some technological innovation is the way to separate, forgive the expression, the wheat from the chaff in information. I also think, just from a personal standpoint, it helps to have a few sources that you really trust, that you can go back to and test your own understanding of what's going on. We all have biases. We all have to become more sensitive to the biases in other people who are not necessarily trying to fool us, but bias in the way we look at a lot of these problems is something that we have to be constantly vigilant against.
Hi, I'm Doy Roque from Manila, and we just elected a new president, who's the son of an old president.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're in a very interesting place right now, and I'm sure you're following this. Considering the China and the U.S.'s positioning in the West Philippine Sea / the South China Sea, and all the American rhetoric about Taiwan, can you give us, share some of your thoughts and maybe risk some prognostication about that part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the Philippines has the basic problem that it has had all along, whether the president is Marcos or Duterte or Aquino or anybody else, that you've got to coexist with China. And the United States is still a very important player in that region. And so the ability to balance between the United States and China is critical. And, you hope that American leaders understand and appreciate that. In terms of Taiwan, obviously, the Philippines is so geographically close to the Taiwan situation that I can well understand that every new burst of rhetoric about Taiwan from Washington or from Beijing is alarming. Let me just say, we think that the risk of a crisis over Taiwan in the near term is quite low. First of all, China has its hands full at the moment. It's a very delicate political and economic moment. The Chinese economy is going through a really painful adjustment as a result of COVID, and the zero COVID policy has really exacerbated that. And I think also one of the takeaways from the war in Ukraine, this is really important, is the Chinese are watching this. The Chinese have been learning lessons from Russia's relationship with the West for decades. The Chinese saw how the Soviet Union collapsed and learned lessons from that. And they're learning lessons from the war in Ukraine right now. And lesson number one is that if you push, Russia invading Ukraine didn't create disunity in the West. It brought the West together in a way that the West had not been together, arguably, since the end of the Cold War. And I think China understands that while it could take Taiwan, that the victory would be so costly in so many different ways that it's simply not worth it, that there is still virtue in, well, you can't hide your strength anymore, but you can still bide your time in China. So, and obviously the Taiwanese are watching what the Ukrainians are doing, and they're learning lessons from that as well. So what I would say for the Philippines is that no matter who the president is, the challenge is the same in balancing positive relations with both China and the US as a matter of strategic necessity. And again, I don't think that Taiwan, everybody's got to be vigilant about Taiwan. I didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine on February 20th. But we don't see a crisis there for the foreseeable future. It's not in China's interest.
Howard Brown from Toronto, Canada. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, who are the opinion leaders of tomorrow who give you hope for the future? And I think of Malala Yousafzai. I read her book many years ago. Pakistani girl that was willing to stand up for women's rights. I think of Greta Thunberg, leading the charge on climate change. You know, I think of the Prime Minister of New Zealand giving me hope for the future. You know, my country, I think, was very involved in the development of the UN. It's led us, obviously, a disappointment, development of the North-South dialogue, development of the G20. And I'm just wondering, you talked about new alliances, but who do you see as, like, the word that strikes me is we're lacking trust. And
Yeah.
that's the problem.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, on the plane here from Canada, I happened to sit beside a guy who was a total, you know, far-right believer that the World Economic Forum was the source of all problems, from a small town that hidden. Where did you get this stuff? And he gets it from the internet. And we drink our own bathwater. How do we get people, how do you reach people nowadays when they don't want to read anything that they don't want to believe? I spent 3 hours on the plane with this guy trying to get him to buy into some concepts. What gives you hope for the future? I want to just build on Ted's question, you know, that how do we find that optimistic tone? Who are those opinion leaders that we need to get, and what's the message we need to get out there?
Let me answer this question in two ways. First of all, I think the first thing that we all need to do, just from a personal standpoint, is we need to listen, including listening to people who make our blood boil, because I can understand for a certain person looking at World Economic Forum as a symbol of globalization, thinking, well, globalization killed the manufacturing sector in my wealthy world country, and that's why it's the root of all evil, and that's why globalism is the wrong answer, and why we need more tribalism. I think we have to listen to a lot of things that we strongly disagree with, because, I mean, my understanding of how you shift someone's thinking is not to tell them that they're wrong, but to listen to them and then get them to expand their thinking rather than to change their thinking. That's the first thing. It's hard because, you know, you have to resist the urge to punch them. But you know, maybe they're right about certain things, and maybe they have something to teach us, even if in the main we continue to disagree with them. On the other point, it's so easy to be cynical about a person like Greta Thunberg. You know, she's this teenage kid, and, you know, the cameras love her because she's provocative and this and that, and Malala and all of this, and it's all sort of feel good, politically correct, blah, blah, blah. I think that cynicism really misses something very important. I'm 57 years old. I didn't grow up in a globalized world. I grew up in a Cold War world. And when I look at younger generations of people who are in their 20s and younger now, they're globalized instinctively. They are digital natives. These are people who are very comfortable in a globalized world in a way that I'm frankly not, as much as I like to talk up the benefits of globalization. I think that where are the leaders? I think the leaders are in younger generations of people who don't share our assumptions about what is and is not possible. I think there are a lot of younger people who say, you keep telling me it's impossible, and I keep telling you it's necessary, so we better find a way to make it possible. And I do think that for small companies, for entrepreneurs, for individuals, I think that the pressure that can be exerted from the ground up is not to be ignored, because there already is generational change in politics. You mentioned Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Look at the political leadership in Sweden and Finland. It's very young and very female. That's the world. They're about to join NATO. So look to the young people as an easy answer, but I think there's something really to that. And I think that outside the box thinking that I was talking about that we expect from entrepreneurs, I have much more confidence that that's going to come from a younger generation of people who grew up in a globalized world than from those of us who are older and like to think in terms of great power politics.
Okay, no, this one
Hello?
also works.
This works. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicola, and I'm from Cape Town in South Africa.
And I really don't want to talk about my president, but now that you've mentioned my friend Greta, I want to ask you about the policy standoff or stalemate on climate change. You have mentioned nothing about climate change, so I'd love to hear your view on that.
Yes. Nice to hear from someone from Cape Town, which is about as beautiful a place as I've ever seen with my own eyes. Yeah, I didn't talk about climate change today because, you know, given what's happening in Ukraine and some of the more immediate issues of inflation and food and fuel, climate change is sort of the next level out. If I had a little bit longer, I would have talked about it. There was actually, I think that what came out of Glasgow was actually surprisingly positive. And again, it's not just governments, it's companies, it's private organizations, it's scientists and activists working with government and exerting pressure saying it's not okay for you not to have a more ambitious plan, and know that we're going to be watching you every week of every month of every year to make sure that you keep the pledges that you made. Look, this is a setback for climate change in a lot of ways, because right now people are just thinking, where are we going to get more oil? Because oil is temporarily back over $100 a barrel because of what's going on with Russia. There's a lot of setback in US politics at the moment, and moving forward on a climate change spending package that the Biden administration made a centerpiece of its campaign, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, again, if you're looking for hope, look at the way the Europeans, your EU leaders designed their COVID relief package. There are a lot of very green rules and regulations in there that make it impossible for companies to do business in Europe that don't want to become greener faster. And hey, the war in Russia, the Russia war on Ukraine is a beautiful illustration of why we need to move off of fossil fuels faster. Again, it's an extremely painful adjustment. I think that the momentum on climate change has been slowed a little bit by what's going on this year. But I think, you know, at Eurasia Group, our view is that of the great looming crises of this decade, that climate is the one where we're seeing more multi-layer progress, and where we're a bit more optimistic that warming can be limited in a lot of ways. Now, second order effects are going to be important. You're going to have to create refugee rights, because there's going to be a lot more climate refugees, and they don't have enough rights at the moment. And the world hasn't built in the resilience to deal with all the follow-on political, economic, and human problems that come with the dislocations that are going to come with that level of climate change that's already baked in. But again, we can't wait on governments to do that. Governments are crucial to that, but pressure on the private sector, use of the public sector, activism, it has to be an all of the above approach.
Yes.
Christina.
Okay, I will be very shortly. Okay, Damir Buglic, I'm Croatian, but I work in Italy. I was wondering, almost half a century ago, very famous people, four of them, Tito, Nasser, Nehru, founded non-aligned countries. So it was a kind of answer to the West and the Russian bloc. Is there any possibility for this kind of solution? Because according to me, I don't have any political opinion from one or to another part, could be a right solution.
India is still doing it. India is still non-aligned. India is.
I know.
Yeah, I think there's very much a future for a non-aligned movement. As I say, you know, India on the one hand has joined the security relationship with the U.S., Japan, and Australia, but on the other hand, they're buying Russian oil, and Prime Minister Modi is very insistent on the independence of Indian foreign policy. I think that the way we need to think about non-aligned movement, though, it shouldn't be as rigid as the non-aligned movement of the Cold War, which wasn't always non-aligned, and wasn't always, non-alignment can sometimes mean lack of involvement. I think what you need is non-aligned movement in all of the issues. We were just talking about climate change, in the battle against disinformation in our information systems, in all kinds of areas, and the mechanization of the workplace, the mechanization of warfare. I think there can be a lot of different non-aligned movements that can contain different players depending what the issue is. Again, it's entrepreneurial thinking. It's spotting an opportunity for cooperation and grabbing it even at a small scale and growing from a small scale. But, you know, waiting for top-down solutions, we're going to be waiting. We're going to be waiting until we're dead. And I think non-alignment as a principle already exists, and it can be expanded in a whole lot of different areas with kind of partnerships of willing, of capable and willing allies to deal with each individual issue.
Christina?
Christina, Ukraine, and I wanted to ask you about nuclear weapons, probably in two dimensions. The first one, where it is in use, worst scenarios, and the second one about the future, because obviously many countries are afraid of Russia because they have nuclear weapons, and how can we get them, like, leave it away?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, for someone from Ukraine, I understand particularly when you start talking about so-called tactical nuclear weapons, where, you know, people talk about these weapons as if they can be used in a different way. I mean, the good news is that the basic rules of mutually assured destruction still apply. If Vladimir Putin really wanted to launch a nuclear weapon, the kinds of weapons they talk about every night on Russian television, it's suicide. And I don't see any sign that the Russians are suicidal, that Vladimir Putin personally is suicidal. And if Vladimir Putin gave the order, I'm not sure that the people whose job it would be to carry that out are suicidal. So I think in the main, I think that the risk that Russia will use nuclear weapons is very low. And I think even with tactical nuclear weapons, that's something that the Chinese are not going to support. Whatever allies of convenience the Russians have, whether it's people who share their strategic worldview or Russian client states, people in China or India or Africa or Latin America who have some sympathy for Russia, nuclear is a line that will change the opinions of pretty much everyone in the world. And what will it achieve? Not very much. I think that the great risk with nuclear weapons today is still control of the material. It's still being able to make sure that all of the material in nuclear weapons is locked down and secure. And that is the problem where you do need top-down management, because you need at least a baseline level of trust between the US and Europe and Russia, that they could actually sit down and negotiate a new arms control treaty that would be abided by. That trust does not exist in the moment. So that's my concern. But I think the headline risk that the Russians are going to up the ante in Ukraine by using a nuclear weapon, we think that the risk of that's quite low.
Okay. Willis, we do appreciate your time dedicated to us. Unfortunately, this is a conversation that we could keep for 2.5 hours more, but unfortunately everybody has a schedule. And thank you for your thoughts, your vision, and we appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.